I'm willing to bet that most of you are at least passingly familiar with the lonely Pablo Escobar meme that has been circulating since the Netflix series Narcos spawned it a few years ago. And likely, many of you are probably equally familiar with the Escobar story and the Colombian drug trade. It's a pretty popular reference to Colombia and the drug trade. But far fewer people are aware of the deep history involved in the rise of the cartels and their strong connections to the Cold War. I'm your host David, and today we are going to be exploring cocaine, Medellin, Cali, Marxism, and the CIA. This is the Cold War. On November 27, 1989, Avianca Flight 203 took off from Bogota, Colombia, bound for Cali. Minutes later, a bomb detonated mid-air, killing all 107 people aboard. This wasn't a random act of terror. It was a chilling message from Pablo Escobar, head of the infamous Medellin cartel. But behind this horrifying act lay more than just drug violence. It was the dark culmination of decades of geopolitical chaos driven by Cold War politics. While the United States and the Soviet Union confronted each other around the globe in their ideological standoff, Colombia became an overlooked front line of a different war, one fought with cocaine, corruption, and covert operations. Powerful drug cartels, especially Medellin and Cali, rose from the turmoil of guerrilla insurgency, weak governance, and American intervention. Ironically, policies designed to fight communism often enabled these drug lords, whose empires thrived in the shadows of CIA operations and anti-communist strategies. During the 1950s and 1960s, Colombia was a nation teetering on the brink. After years of civil war known as La Violencia, a conflict that left over 200,000 people dead, the country found itself plagued by political instability, deep poverty, and a government too weak or unwilling to establish genuine control. Into this power vacuum stepped radical leftist guerrilla groups like the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, or Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, better known as simply FARC, and the ELN, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, the National Liberation Army. Inspired by Cuba's revolution and driven by Marxist ideology, these insurgencies vowed to topple Colombia's conservative government. For the United States, locked in its global struggle against communism, Colombia became yet another front line in the Cold War. Washington's response was swift and straightforward: funnel massive military aid and counterinsurgency training into Colombia. CIA operatives quietly embedded themselves within Colombia's security apparatus, prioritizing anti-communist victories over everything else, including the burgeoning drug trade. To American policymakers at the time, cocaine trafficking barely registered as a threat compared to the specter of communism. This oversight proved catastrophic. While American-trained Colombian forces chased guerrillas through the jungle, drug traffickers quietly expanded their operations, exploiting the chaos. They built networks across Central America and the Caribbean, leveraging weak governance and rampant corruption. By the mid-1970s, cocaine had become Colombia's fastest-growing export, feeding skyrocketing demand in the United States. As Washington finally began to notice the tidal wave of drugs flooding American streets, the stage was already set. Powerful traffickers had transformed themselves into cartel bosses, their empires thriving amid the chaos of Cold War geopolitics. The perfect storm had arrived, and as its center were two names the world would soon learn to fear: Medellin and Cali. By the late 1970s, Colombia's cocaine trade had become too profitable and too dangerous to ignore. Two distinct cartels rose to prominence, each shaped by Colombia's turbulent Cold War landscape: the violent, confrontational Medellin cartel and its quieter, yet equally ruthless rival, the Cali cartel. At the forefront of Medellin stood Pablo Escobar, a charismatic yet ruthless trafficker whose ambitions went far beyond money. Joined by partners like the Ochoa brothers and Carlos Leder, Escobar built a drug empire fueled by violence, intimidation, and strategic alliances. His policy of plata o plomo, silver or lead, became infamous, forcing politicians, police, and judges to accept bribes or face death. Escobar didn't just operate from the shadows. He cultivated a populist Robin Hood image, building housing, soccer fields, and schools for Medellin's poor. Yet his cartel's brutality was unparalleled, leaving a trail of bodies in its wake. To protect their cocaine profits and plantations from guerrilla kidnappers, Medellin leaders allied themselves with right-wing paramilitaries like Muerte a Secuestradores, death to kidnappers. These paramilitaries, originally supported by wealthy landowners and covertly trained through CIA-backed anti-guerrilla programs, found themselves inadvertently benefiting from American Cold War policies. While the CIA's intent was purely anti-communist, their operations provided training and resources that paramilitaries ultimately used to bolster cartel power. Meanwhile, in Cali, another powerful cartel took a different path. Led by the Rodriguez-Orejuela brothers, the Cali cartel chose subtlety over spectacle, preferring corruption and business acumen over outright violence. They infiltrated legitimate businesses, politics, and Colombia's elite circles, laundering vast sums of drug money through corporate fronts. Unlike Escobar's open warfare, Cali operated quietly, keeping violence discreet and bribing officials rather than assassinating them publicly. This low-profile approach allowed the cartel to embed itself deeply into Colombia's institutions. Both cartels owed their rise, at least partially, to Cold War conditions. While Medellin thrived on chaos, violence, and paramilitary alliances, Cali benefited from the instability, quietly embedding itself into Colombia's elite and political class. Despite their differences, both groups exploited an environment where U.S. foreign policy prioritized fighting communists over drug traffickers, and where a weak Colombian state proved unable or unwilling to push back. By the mid-1980s, these two cartels had grown powerful enough to dominate global cocaine markets. And as their power grew, their paths inevitably crossed with Cold War geopolitics once again, bringing violence and corruption not just to Colombia, but to the doorsteps of American policymakers themselves. As Medellin and Cali tightened their grip on Colombia's cocaine trade, the CIA found itself navigating a complicated dilemma. Throughout the Cold War, America's primary goal in Latin America was clear: stop communism by any means necessary. But the methods employed sometimes led to contradictions, unintended consequences, and uncomfortable alliances, especially with drug traffickers. One notorious example was Panama's dictator, Old Pineapple Face, otherwise known as Manuel Noriega. For decades, Noriega was a valued CIA asset, providing critical intelligence against communist threats in Central America. However, he simultaneously maintained lucrative partnerships with Colombian traffickers, particularly the Medellin cartel, allowing cocaine shipments and money laundering to flow freely through Panama. For years, the CIA turned a blind eye, tolerating Noriega's drug trafficking because of his strategic anti-communist value. Only when he became an embarrassment, and when the Cold War was winding down, did the US finally remove him in a high-profile invasion in 1989. Further north, in Nicaragua, another scandal emerged. The Reagan administration was actively supporting the Contras, anti-communist rebels fighting Nicaragua's Marxist Sandinista government. But funding these guerrillas proved difficult due to congressional restrictions. To circumvent this, some Contra factions began trafficking cocaine into the United States using networks connected to the Medellin cartel. Revelations by DEA informant and drug smuggler Barry Seal exposed these operations. The DEA is the Drug Enforcement Agency, by the way. When Seal captured photographs of Medellin operatives alongside Sandinista officials, President Reagan himself used this evidence publicly to argue that communist Nicaragua was complicit in drug trafficking, despite the Contras' own similar involvement. A U.S. Senate inquiry later revealed the extent of this contradiction, showing that elements within the CIA had at least tacitly allowed cocaine trafficking to continue if it helped fund anti-communist forces. These operations blurred the line between fighting communism and inadvertently supporting the drug trade, ironically fueling the same cocaine epidemic devastating American cities. Meanwhile, allegations surfaced involving Cuba and Fidel Castro's government, accused of permitting Colombian drug planes to refuel on Cuban soil in exchange for cash. While details remain controversial, these accusations underscored how even ideological enemies in the Cold War could find common ground in the lucrative cocaine trade. Ultimately, CIA Cold War strategies, whether through deliberate alliances or blind eyes, helped create an environment where traffickers like Escobar and the Rodriguez-Orejuela brothers thrived. The unintended legacy was clear. In fighting communism, American Cold War policies inadvertently paved the way for cartel dominance, forever changing Colombia and spreading violence across borders. By the late 1980s, Pablo Escobar had become more than just a drug trafficker. He was at war with the Colombian state itself. Determined to avoid extradition to the United States, where he faced a lifetime in prison, Escobar launched a brutal campaign of terror aiming to intimidate Colombia's government into submission. His tactics were devastatingly clear. In 1989 alone, Escobar's cartel orchestrated the assassination of presidential hopeful Luis Carlos Galán, whose anti-cartel stance had made him a powerful symbol of resistance. Escobar's hit squads killed judges, journalists, and countless police officers, pushing Colombia's institutions to the breaking point. Most chillingly, Escobar ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, intending to kill another anti-cartel presidential candidate who, as it happened, never boarded the plane. Perhaps most dramatically, Escobar's cartel allegedly partnered with the leftist guerrilla group M19 during their infamous 1985 siege of the Palace of Justice in Bogotá. The attack resulted in the deaths of nearly half of Colombia's Supreme Court justices, conveniently destroying evidence supporting the extradition of cartel leaders. Though the full truth remains contested, this event showcased how Colombia's cartel wars were now directly shaping the nation's political future. Incidentally, this also happens to be one of my earliest memories of watching this happen on the news in real time. But faced with unprecedented violence, Colombia's government, assisted quietly by the United States, intensified efforts to hunt Escobar down. U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA and DEA, provided crucial surveillance and logistical support to Colombia's security forces. The hunt intensified further with the creation of a ruthless vigilante group, Los Pepes, an alliance of the Cali Cartel, rogue paramilitaries, and corrupt elements within Colombian security forces. Though the U.S. officially denied involvement, credible accounts suggest American agencies at least tolerated and possibly facilitated Los Pepes' violent campaign against Escobar's family, associates, and infrastructure. The strategy worked. After months of relentless pressure, Pablo Escobar was finally cornered and killed by Colombian police in December 1993. His death marked the dramatic collapse of the Medellin cartel, ending one of the bloodiest chapters in Colombia's history. Escobar's war demonstrated vividly how drug cartels shaped by Cold War conditions could bring an entire nation to its knees, and how geopolitical conflicts could spill into brutal local realities, leaving scars that would last generations. With Pablo Escobar dead and the Medellin cartel in ruins, many hoped Colombia's drug wars would finally ease. Instead, power shifted quietly, but decisively, to the Cali cartel. Under the calculated leadership of brothers Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, Cali avoided the headline-grabbing violence that had made Escobar infamous. Instead, they built their empire through subtle infiltration, bribes over bombs, influence over intimidation. Cali's bosses understood that open violence attracted unwanted attention. They laundered billions in cocaine profits through legitimate businesses, buying politicians, police, and even judicial officials. In one shocking example, Cali's money allegedly reached the highest levels of Colombian politics, financing Ernesto Semper's successful 1994 presidential campaign. Their quiet influence ran so deep that the Cali cartel earned the nickname the Gentlemen of Cali. However, by the mid-1990s, the Cold War was over, and American policymakers had begun prioritizing the drug war as a top security issue. With communism no longer the central enemy, the US turned its full attention towards dismantling the remaining cartel empire in Colombia. Under intense pressure from American law enforcement, Colombian authorities launched a wave of operations against Cali's leaders. Between 1995 and 1996, Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela were captured, convicted, and ultimately extradited to the United States. Yet the fall of Cali didn't bring peace to Colombia. Instead, the cocaine trade fragmented into smaller, harder-to-track networks, setting the stage for continued violence. By the late 1990s, Colombia, with substantial U.S. assistance, embarked on Plan Colombia, an aggressive and heavily militarized anti-narcotics campaign. The Cold War had unintentionally nurtured the very cartels now being fought, and while the Cali cartel's quiet empire ended, Colombia's long battle with drugs, violence, and corruption was far from over. The story of Colombia's cocaine cartels during the Cold War reveals a striking irony. In its zealous battle against communism, the United States inadvertently helped fuel the rise of criminal empires whose impact stretched far beyond Latin America. Medellin and Cali were not just drug syndicates, they were unintended creations of Cold War chaos, beneficiaries of geopolitical contradictions, covert deals, and policy blind spots. As superpowers clashed over ideology, cartels thrived, using violence and corruption to reshape Colombia's society and political landscape. American cities paid a heavy price too, flooded with cocaine and scarred by violence linked directly to Cold War-era drug trafficking networks. Ultimately, the fall of Escobar and the dismantling of Cali marked the end of an era, but not the end of the problem. The narco states born during the Cold War left behind deep wounds, shaping Colombia's modern history and influencing global policy in ways still felt today. The real legacy of this conflict isn't just about the Cold War or cocaine, it's a stark reminder of how easily geopolitics can spiral into unintended consequences, leaving generations to confront the aftermath of decisions made in the shadows. So the episode is over, but not quite. Call this a short postscript to add in something else that didn't 100% fit the rest of the episode, but was too interesting to leave out. So Pablo Escobar left behind many things: a nation scarred by violence, a fractured political system, and a criminal blueprint that outlived him. But perhaps the strangest remnant of his narco empire is a herd of hippopotamus. In the 1980s, flush with cartel wealth and a taste for excess, Escobar built a personal zoo on his estate, Hacienda Nápoles. Alongside elephants, ostriches, and giraffes, he imported 4 African hippos. Because of course, why not? When the state dismantled his empire after his death in 1993, most of the animals were relocated, but not the hippos. Authorities considered them too large and aggressive to move, so they stayed, and they multiplied. Fast forward 3 decades, and those 4 hippos have turned into over 170. They now roam wild across Colombia's Magdalena River basin, far from their native Africa. And unlike the cartels that once ruled the region, these hippos aren't exactly discreet. They trample crops, threaten communities, and wreak havoc on local ecosystems, competing with native wildlife and polluting waterways with their waste. In 2023, the Colombian government, after years of failed sterilization attempts, was ordered by the courts to take action. A multi-pronged plan is now underway: sterilization, relocation, and if necessary, euthanasia. It's controversial, expensive, and dangerous. But what else would you expect from the country still wrestling with the fallout of one man's cocaine-fueled kingdom? In the end, the cocaine hippos may be Escobar's most bizarre legacy, living symbols of an era when Cold War chaos, drug money, and unchecked power collided in surreal and devastating ways. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is currently trying to arrange the purchase of a midget submarine that it hopes to fill with illegal narcotics and start a new cartel. Maybe this bell button stuff is getting out of hand. Anyway, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.